The wind from the Wyoming foothills carried a cold that could break a man's spirit before it broke his bones. December of 1885 had settled over the territory like an iron weight, pressing down on every fence post, every cabin, every living thing that dared remain outdoors after the sun dropped behind the mountains. Silas Hartwell had lived through enough Wyoming winters to know when a storm would dig in for days, and the way those clouds hung low over the western ridge told him this would be one of those nights that tested everything a man had built. He tightened his buffalo coat against the wind and lifted the kerosene lantern higher, watching shadows dance across the snow as he walked the fence line between his barn and the main corral. His Winchester Model 1873 rested across his back, the weight as familiar as his own heartbeat. At 40 years old, Silas moved with the careful economy of a man who understood that wasted motion in winter could mean frozen fingers or worse. The foothills west of Laramie stretched out behind his 160 acres like the spine of some sleeping giant. And tonight that giant was breathing hard. He checked each gate with practiced movements, the kind that came from 7 years of living alone on this stretch of land. No family visited, no neighbors stayed long. After his brother Jonas died in the spring of 1878, Silas had built this place with his own hands and walked these boundaries by himself ever since. He preferred it that way. Work kept his mind from sliding back into memories he had tried to bury alongside his brother. As he reached for the barn door latch, ready to close everything tight for the night, a sound cut through the wind, not the groan of wood or the cry of some animal seeking shelter. This was sharper, thinner, almost swallowed by the storm but unmistakably human. Silas froze with his hand on the latch. The sound came again, weaker this time, like someone trying to breathe through pain that had lasted too long. In 15 years of living in the West, Silas Hartwell had learned that human sounds in a blizzard meant only one thing. Someone was dying. He lowered the lantern and followed the noise around the back corner of the barn, boots crunching through snow that had drifted waist-deep against the northern wall. His breath came out in short bursts of vapor. The temperature had dropped past 10 degrees, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Whatever he found back here, it would not be good. The tracks appeared first, a narrow, uneven trail of footprints leading toward the far wall of the barn, each depression already filling with fresh snow. Someone had crawled here, dragging themselves forward when walking became impossible. Silas raised the lantern and saw her. An Apache woman lay collapsed against the barn wall, her body curled tight in a position that spoke of desperate attempts to preserve any remaining warmth. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with long black hair now matted with frost and snow. Her deerskin dress had been torn across the chest, the neckline ripped wide in a way that spoke of rough hands and violence. The tear exposed not just skin but dark bruising along her shoulder and collarbone. Her feet were bare, scraped raw from running over frozen ground, and her lips had lost all color. Silas dropped to one knee beside her, setting the lantern in the snow. He had seen enough men die from cold during his cavalry years to recognize the signs. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Her skin had taken on a waxy quality that meant the body was shutting down, conserving heat for the vital organs and abandoning everything else. She had maybe 30 minutes left, perhaps less. When he touched her arm through the torn dress, she flinched so hard it nearly knocked her sideways into the snow. Her eyes opened partway, unfocused and wild with fear. She tried to pull away but had no strength left. Her fingers trembled violently, and she made a sound low in her throat that was not quite a word, but carried all the terror of someone who expected the next touch to bring more pain. "Easy," Silas said, keeping his voice steady and low. He made no sudden movements. "I am not here to hurt you." She watched him through those half-open eyes, searching his face for signs of the violence she had obviously endured. The fear ran deep, carved into her expression like words on a headstone. She was not afraid of the cold or the storm. She was afraid of him, afraid of what men could do. Silas understood that fear. He had seen it before in the faces of survivors who had learned that human beings could be more dangerous than any winter. He also understood that explanations would mean nothing. Words were cheap. Only actions would tell her who he was. He took off his buffalo coat, moving slowly so she could see every motion. The cold bit into him immediately through his flannel shirt, but he wrapped the heavy coat around her shoulders without touching her skin. Then he slid one arm behind her back and the other under her legs, lifting her as carefully as he would lift an injured colt. She was too light, far too light for a grown woman, and the way she stiffened against his chest told him she was not used to being touched without harm following. He adjusted his grip to make sure the coat stayed closed over the torn neckline of her dress and began walking toward his cabin with long, direct strides. The wind pushed against him, but Silas had carried wounded men across worse ground during the war. He kept his breathing even and his steps steady, letting his body heat begin the work of warming her through the thick buffalo hide. Behind them, the barn stood dark and silent. The storm erased their tracks within minutes, covering the evidence of her arrival as thoroughly as falling snow could cover blood. Whatever had driven her here, whatever she was running from, the blizzard was buying them time. Silas did not know yet whether that time would be enough. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a single light burning in the window to mark its location. Silas kicked the door open and carried her inside, into air made warm by the pot-belly stove that had been burning since afternoon. He moved directly to the bed, the only real piece of furniture besides the table and chair, and lowered her onto the mattress with the same care he had used to lift her. The quilt was thick wool, made from old army blankets and shirts he had stitched together during his first winter alone. He pulled it up around her shoulders, tucking it close so only her face remained exposed. Her eyes fluttered open again, wider this time, taking in the small cabin with its log walls, single window, and sparse furnishings. She tried to sit up, panic rising again, as she realized she was inside an enclosed space with a man she did not know. "I am not here to hurt you," Silas repeated. He stepped back from the bed, giving her space, giving her air to breathe. "You are safe." The word safe seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, her breathing still fast and uneven, waiting for the other boot to drop. When he made no move toward her, when he simply turned and walked to the hearth to add wood to the fire, something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first faint possibility that she might survive the night. Silas kept his movements deliberate and predictable. He stoked the fire until flames rose higher, filling the cabin with heat that would drive the cold from her bones. He filled a tin pot with water from the barrel near the door and set it on the stove to warm. He moved to the small shelf where he kept his limited medical supplies, items left over from his cavalry days, and began laying out clean cloths and a jar of salve. Through all of this, he felt her eyes on him. She was reading him the way a scout reads terrain, looking for threats, measuring distances, planning escape routes. Silas understood. He had done the same thing in enemy territory. The difference was that he did not consider himself her enemy, and he needed to prove that through patience, not words. He poured the warm water into a tin cup and set it on the small table next to the bed, close enough for her to reach, but far enough that he did not have to approach her directly. Then he returned to the chair near the hearth and sat down, angling himself so she could see him, but so he was not directly facing her. It was an old trick he had learned dealing with spooked horses. Sometimes not looking directly at a frightened creature was the kindest thing you could do. Minutes passed with only the crackle of wood in the stove and the low whistle of wind outside. Silas listened to her breathing begin to slow, watched from the corner of his eye as her grip on the quilt relaxed slightly. She was warming. Her body was deciding she might live. That was the first step. "Drink when you can," he said quietly, nodding toward the cup on the table. "Just water, nothing else." She did not respond, but after another minute, she reached out slowly and took the cup with both hands. The trembling in her fingers made the water shake, but she managed to bring it to her lips. She drank in small sips, testing first to see if the water was safe, then drinking more deeply when her body recognized what it needed. Silas stayed in his chair, hands folded in his lap, making no move toward her. He had fought in enough battles to know when to advance and when to hold position. Tonight was a night for holding. The cabin grew warmer. The storm outside intensified, wind hammering at the walls and rattling the single window in its frame. Silas stood once to add more wood to the fire, then returned to his chair. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from or what had happened to her. Those questions could wait until she decided to answer them. Eventually her eyes began to close. Not all at once, but in slow stages. her body finally accepting that immediate danger had passed. Silas watched her drift towards sleep and felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar weight he had not carried in years, the responsibility of another life. He knew what he had found in the snow, a woman who had been running for her life, who had pushed herself past the point where most people would have given up and died. The torn dress, the bruising, the bare feet in December, all of it told a story he had heard before during his cavalry years. Human trafficking was not new to the West. Men bought and sold other human beings the same way they bought and sold cattle, and the law often looked the other way when the victims were Apache. Silas stood and walked quietly to the small trunk at the foot of the bed. He opened it and removed one of his old flannel shirts, faded from years of washing, but still whole. He set it on the chair nearest the bed, close enough for her to reach in the morning. She would need something to wear that was not torn, something that covered her without reminding her of violence. He took his bedroll from where it hung on the wall and spread it on the floor near the door. It was not comfortable, but he had slept on worse ground during the war. The placement was intentional. If she woke in panic and tried to run, he would be between her and the door. Not to stop her, but to wake and talk her down before she fled into a storm that would kill her within an hour. Before he lay down, Silas walked once more to the window and looked out into the darkness. Snow fell so thick he could barely see the barn. Whatever tracks the woman had left were long gone now, buried under fresh powder. If someone was following her, they would find no trail to pursue. The storm had given them that much mercy at least. He checked the Winchester, making sure it was loaded and within easy reach, then stretched out on the bedroll. The floor was hard and cold, but Silas had learned long ago how to find sleep in uncomfortable places. What kept him awake longer than the floor was the question of what would come next. Someone had hurt this woman badly enough that she had run barefoot into a blizzard. Someone might come looking for her. And when they did, Silas would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He thought of Jonas, buried on a hillside 7 years gone. His brother had died protecting someone else, standing up for what was right even when it meant going against powerful men. Silas had sworn after that night never to put himself in that position again. He had chosen isolation over involvement, solitude over responsibility. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The woman's breathing evened out into the rhythm of deep sleep. Silas listened to it mix with the sound of wind and fire, forming a kind of music he had forgotten existed. The music of another person sharing space with him, of not being alone. He closed his eyes and let himself drift, one hand resting on the Winchester, ready for whatever the morning would bring. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window, washing the interior in shades of gray and white. Silas woke instantly, the way soldiers learn to wake, his hand moving to the rifle before his eyes fully opened. But the cabin was quiet, no immediate threat, just the dying fire in the stove and the sound of wind that had finally begun to ease. He sat up and had looked toward the bed. The woman was awake, sitting with her back against the wall, the quilt pulled up to her chin. She watched him with eyes that were clearer than the night before, no longer clouded by hypothermia, but still carrying that deep wariness. She had survived the night. That was something. Silas stood slowly, making sure she saw every movement before he made it. He walked to the stove and began rebuilding the fire, adding kindling and then larger pieces of split pine. The flames caught quickly, and soon heat began radiating through the cabin again. He filled his dented coffee pot with water and grounds, setting it on the stove to boil. The familiar routine of morning helped, gave him something to do with his hands while she decided whether to speak. He was halfway through slicing bacon when she finally broke the silence. Her voice came out rough and hoarse, damaged by cold and screaming, and who knew what else. "Where am I?" Silas did not turn around, did not make eye contact. He just kept working with the bacon, laying strips in the cast iron skillet. "My land, 160 acres about 40 miles west of Laramie. Homestead claim from 1878. Who are you?" "Silas Hartwell." He paused. "And you?" Another long silence. He could feel her weighing the risk of giving her name, deciding if that piece of herself was safe to share. Finally, barely above a whisper, she said, "Kaya." "Kaya," Silas repeated, making sure he said it correctly. He nodded once, still focused on the bacon. "This is my place." You are safe here tonight and as many nights as you need. The bacon began to sizzle. Silas felt her eyes still on him, watching for any sign that his words were lies. He understood. Words meant nothing to someone who had been betrayed by promises before. Only time would prove whether he was telling the truth. He set the bacon aside when it was done and began mixing cornmeal batter in a wooden bowl, adding a little water, a pinch of salt, some bacon grease. The batter went into a smaller skillet, and soon the smell of cornbread joined the bacon. Simple food, but honest, the kind that kept a man alive through winter. While the cornbread cooked, Silas poured himself coffee and stood near the window, looking out at a world transformed by snow. The storm had left at least 2 feet of fresh powder, maybe more in the drifts. His fence lines had disappeared under white blankets. The path to the barn was completely erased. It would take most of the day just to dig out enough to tend the horses. "Is anyone else here?" Kaya asked from the bed. Her voice was stronger now, fed by warmth and rest. "Just me." Silas took a sip of coffee. "Have been for 7 years." "You live alone?" "I do." He heard her shift on the bed, the quilt rustling. When he glanced over, she had pulled herself into a sitting position, her legs tucked under her, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She was studying the cabin more carefully now, taking in the single chair, the single plate on the shelf, the photograph in a wooden frame propped on the mantel. Everything spoke of a man who had built a life for one person and had no expectation of that changing. "How did you find me?" she asked. Silas turned the cornbread, checking the bottom for the right amount of brown. "Heard you by the barn. Your tracks were different, staggered. Someone injured or freezing walks like that. You could have left me there." "Could have." He met her eyes for the first time that morning. Was not going to do that. Something in his face must have convinced her because she nodded slowly and looked down at her hands. They were still trembling slightly, but not from cold now, from the memory of what cold had almost done. Silas plated the bacon and cornbread on 2 tin plates and brought one to the table near her. He set it down without ceremony and returned to his chair with his own plate. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable but simply honest. Neither of them were people who filled air with empty words. When she had eaten most of what he had given her, Kaya spoke again. "What do you want me to do?" Silas looked up from his plate. "Do, Joe? In exchange for the food, the shelter, what do you want?" The question landed hard in his chest. She was so used to transactions, to men who wanted something for what they gave, that she could not imagine someone simply helping without expecting payment. "Nothing," Silas said. "You do not owe me anything." "Then why help?" He considered the question, really considered it. Why had he helped? He could have walked away, could have convinced himself the sound was just a wind, just some animal. Could have saved himself from whatever complications her presence would bring. "Because leaving someone to die in the snow is not who I am," he said finally, "or not who I want to be." Kaya watched him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching for the lie, the angle, the hidden cost. When she did not find it, something shifted in her expression again. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of belief that such a person could exist. The morning stretched on. Silas cleared the plates and set them in the wash basin. He added more wood to the fire. He moved around the cabin doing small tasks, giving her space to process, to decide what came next. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the snow into something that glittered like crushed diamonds. "They are looking for me," Kaya said suddenly. Silas turned from where he stood near the window. She had pulled the quilt tighter around herself, and her face had gone pale again. "The men who had me, they will be looking." "How many?" "4, maybe more by now." Her voice dropped lower. "They do this for money, buy and sell people, women mostly. I was not the only one." Silas felt his jaw tighten. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way suspicion never could. "How long did they have you?" 17 days. The words came out flat, without emotion, the way people spoke about trauma, too big to feel all at once. "We were traveling, 4 of us, stopped for water near Fort Laramie. They were waiting, said they would help us. By the time we understood what they were, it was too late." "The others?" "Sold or taken somewhere else, I do not know." She looked down at her hands. "I waited for a chance." watched them every day. They tied my hands at night, talked about where they would take me, who would pay the most. Then 2 nights ago, they drank too much whiskey. I cut the ropes with broken glass and ran, in bare feet through a blizzard. Better to die free than live as property. The simple truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Silas understood it completely. He had seen men choose death over capture during the war, had understood even then that some fates were worse than dying. "Are they coming here?" he asked. "I do not know. The storm covered my tracks, but they are looking. The leader, Garrett Voss, he does not stop once he decides something is his." Her voice hardened on that word. His. He has papers, fake documents that say I am his ward, that he is taking me to a reservation. If law comes, they will believe him, not me. Silas walked to the shelf where he kept the Winchester and checked the ammunition. Full magazine, round in the chamber. He had not fired it in months, but he kept it clean and ready out of habit. Old cavalry habits died hard. "For now, you stay here," he said. "Rest, get your strength back. We will figure the rest out when you are steady enough to stand. And if they find this place?" He looked at her, and something in his expression must have answered the question, because she did not ask it again. Silas Hartwell had killed men before, during the war and once afterward when his brother died. He was not eager to kill again, but he would not hand over an innocent woman to slavers. That line was drawn in stone. The fire crackled. The wind picked up outside, blowing loose snow against the window in soft whispers. Kaya pulled the quilt tighter and closed her eyes, exhaustion taking her again despite the fear. Sleep was what her body needed, and her body was taking it whether her mind agreed or not. Silas stood watch by the window, his hand resting on the Winchester, his eyes scanning the white expanse beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, 4 men were searching for the woman asleep in his bed. Somewhere out there, a confrontation was building like another storm on the horizon. He thought again of Jonas, of the choice his brother had made to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. Silas had run from that choice for 7 years, buried himself in isolation to avoid ever having to make it again. But it seemed that choice had found him anyway, carried on the wind of a Wyoming blizzard, collapsed in the snow beside his barn. And this time, alone on his land with no one to help and no law to trust, Silas would have to decide once and for all what kind of man he truly was. The photograph on the mantel caught his eye. 2 young men in cavalry uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling. Brothers who thought they had a future ahead of them. Only one of those men had survived to see this day, and he carried the weight of the other's ghost like a stone in his chest. Silas turned away from the photograph and looked back at Kaya, sleeping fitfully in his bed. The responsibility of another life pressed down on him with familiar weight, but this time he did not push it away. This time he let it settle into his bones, let it remind him why Jonas had died and what that death was supposed to mean. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire burned steady. And between the two, Silas Hartwell made his choice and prepared for whatever would come next. 3 days after the blizzard passed, the Wyoming Territory lay under a blanket of snow so perfect and white it hurt to look at under the midday sun. The temperature had risen just enough to make the air breathable, though frost still clung to every surface come morning. Silas stood at his cabin window watching the tree line to the east through the brass telescope he had carried home from his cavalry days. The instrument was old but reliable, and through its lens he could see things that would take another man hours to discover on foot. What he saw made his blood run cold. Smoke, thin and gray, rising from behind a stand of lodgepole pines about 5 miles distant. Not the thick black smoke of a forest fire, but the careful, controlled smoke of a campfire. Someone was out there, and they were not just passing through. The smoke had been visible for 2 mornings now, always in roughly the same location. Someone was making camp, searching in a pattern, moving methodically across the foothills like a man looking for something lost. Silas lowered the telescope and turned to where Kaya sat at the small table, using his spare hunting knife to cut rope into precise lengths. She had recovered her strength over the past 3 days, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of nights haunted by dreams she would not discuss. She wore his old flannel shirt tucked into her torn deerskin dress, and her long black hair was tied back in a practical braid. She looked up as he set the telescope aside, reading the tension in his shoulders. "They are close," she said. "Not a question. 5 miles east, making camp, searching." Silas walked to the wall where he kept his weapons. The Winchester came down first, followed by his Colt Peacemaker revolver. He checked both with the automatic motions of a man who had cleaned and loaded firearms so many times his hands knew the work without thought from his brain. "We need to be ready." Kaya set down the knife and stood. Over the past 3 days, Silas had taught her the basics of the warning system he was installing around the cabin. Tin cans strung on piano wire, positioned at angles that would make them rattle if anything larger than a rabbit passed through certain choke points. Bear traps at key approaches, their steel jaws capable of crippling a man or horse. Tripwires connected to shotgun shells that would fire with a sound loud enough to wake the dead. It was not fancy, but it was effective. Silas had learned these techniques from Apache scouts during his cavalry years, though he saw the irony in using their methods to protect one of their own from white men. The West had a way of twisting things like that, making allies out of enemies and enemies out of people who should have been friends. "Show me how to shoot," Kaya said. Silas looked at her. She stood with her spine straight, chin lifted, hands steady. 3 days ago, she had been half dead from cold and trauma. Now she was asking to learn how to kill. The transformation spoke to something deep in her character, some core of steel that had kept her alive when most people would have given up. "You sure?" he asked. "I will not be helpless again. If they come, I fight." Silas nodded once and retrieved the Colt from where it lay on the table. The revolver was heavy, nearly 3 pounds of steel and walnut, but smaller than the Winchester. He showed her how to hold it properly, 2 hands for stability, trigger finger along the frame until ready to fire. How to aim center mass, not try for fancy headshots like dime novels pretended were easy. How to expect the recoil, let the gun rise naturally, bring it back down for the second shot. They spent an hour in the cold behind the cabin, Kaya firing at a target Silas had nailed to a pine tree. 6 shots from the cylinder, then reload. 6 more shots. The girl had steady hands and good instincts. By the time the sun reached its peak, she could put 4 out of 6 rounds into a man-sized target at 20 feet. Good enough to stop someone trying to hurt her. Good enough to make Silas feel slightly less worried about leaving her alone while he did what needed to be done. That night, as darkness settled over the snow and the temperature dropped back below freezing, the warning cans rang for the first time. Silas was on his feet before the second rattle, Winchester in hand, moving to the window on instinct. Kaya grabbed the Colt from where it lay on the table and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, exactly as he had taught her. No panic, just smooth motion into defensive positions. Good. Through the window, Silas saw a shape moving in the darkness about 100 yards out. A man on horseback riding slowly, carefully, testing the approach. The horse's breath came out in white plumes and moonlight gleamed off something metal in the rider's hand, a rifle probably. The man was trying to scout the cabin without announcing himself, figure out who lived here and whether it was worth the risk. Silas made the decision in half a second. Better to confront now on his terms than to wait for them to choose the moment. He opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch, Winchester leveled at the approaching rider. The cold hit him like a fist, but he ignored it. His voice carried clear and hard across the snow. "You are trespassing. State your business or turn around." The rider stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind and the creak of leather as the horse shifted its weight. Then the man spoke, his voice rough and amused, like he found something funny in being caught. "Just looking for shelter. Friend, saw your smoke. Long way between places out here. Shelter is 10 miles east at McGregor's ranch. Keep riding." The man leaned forward in his saddle, peering at Silas through the darkness. "You alone out here?" "Alone or not does not concern you. You have 30 seconds to be moving." Another pause. The rider was calculating, weighing options. Silas could almost see the thoughts moving behind the man's eyes. How fast could he draw his rifle? Was the man on the porch someone to worry about, or just a homesteader playing tough? Silas let the Winchester's barrel drop slightly, pointing more directly at the rider's chest. A small movement, but one that carried a clear message. The rider noticed. He raised one hand slowly, showing it empty. No need for trouble, just asking. But even as he spoke, his eyes were scanning the cabin, counting windows, looking for other occupants, memorizing the layout. This was not a man seeking shelter. This was a scout gathering intelligence. "Time's up," Silas said. The rider nodded slowly, turned his horse, and began riding back the way he came. Not hurrying, not showing fear, but definitely leaving. Silas watched until the figure disappeared into the darkness beyond his fence line, then stood on the porch another 10 minutes, making sure no one else was approaching from another direction. When he finally returned inside, Kaya was still pressed against the wall, the Colt held ready. She lowered it only when he closed and barred the door. "That was one of them," she said. Her voice was tight, controlled, but Silas heard the fear underneath. "Deckard," I recognize his voice. Silas set the Winchester on the table and walked to the stove, adding wood to bring the heat back up. He was scouting, counting how many people are here, looking for weaknesses. They will be back. When? Tonight if they are stupid. Tomorrow night if they are smart. He turned to face her. Either way, we have maybe 24 hours to prepare. What Silas did not tell her was that the rider had seen enough. Seen that Silas was alone, or seemed to be. Seen that the cabin was small and remote. Seen that help was far away and winter made movement difficult. All things that would make desperate men feel confident about trying something violent. They spent that night taking turns on watch, one sleeping while the other sat by the window with weapons close at hand. The warning cans did not ring again, but Silas did not relax. Silence could mean safety, but it could also mean the enemy was pulling back to plan something worse. Morning came cold and clear. Silas was checking the perimeter, walking the line where his property met open range, when he heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. His hand went to the Colt at his hip, but he relaxed when he recognized the rider. Duncan McGregor rode up on his big sorrel gelding, the same weathered face Silas had known for years, showing new concern. The old Scottish rancher dismounted with practiced ease despite his 62 years. "Silas," Duncan called as he approached, raising one hand in greeting. "Saw your smoke. Thought I would check on you after that storm." But something in Duncan's face told Silas this was not a social visit. The old rancher looked troubled, and Duncan McGregor was not a man who troubled easily. They met at the fence line. Duncan dismounted and stood holding his reins, his breath steaming in the morning air. He glanced toward the cabin, then back to Silas. "We need to talk," Duncan said quietly. "But not out here. Someone might be watching." Inside the cabin, Duncan removed his hat and nodded respectfully to Kaya, who stood near the stove. If he was surprised to see an Apache woman in Silas Hartwell's cabin, he did not show it. Duncan had seen enough of the West to know that surprising things happened in remote places, and a man's private business was his own unless he chose to share it. Silas poured coffee into 3 tin cups, and they sat at the small table. Duncan warmed his hands on the cup and spoke in a low voice. "I was in Hartville yesterday, buying supplies. There are men asking questions." He looked at Kaya. "About a young Apache woman, saying she ran away from their custody, that they have legal right to bring her back." Kaya's face went pale. Silas felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of legal right?" he asked. "Papers from the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. Documents saying she is a ward of a man named Garrett Bosses, that he is transporting her to Pine Ridge Reservation under authority of the Indian Appropriation Act." Duncan's expression made clear what he thought of those documents. "Sheriff looked at the papers, said they appeared legitimate." "They are not," Kaya said. Her voice was hard. "Voss kidnapped me and 3 others. Those papers are forged." Duncan nodded slowly. "I believe you, but the law might not. If Voss files a complaint with the territorial marshal, if he claims Silas is harboring a fugitive, there could be trouble. Legal trouble." Silas stood and walked to the window. The morning sun made the snow almost blinding, and he had to squint against the glare. Legal trouble. The word sat heavy in his gut. After Jonas died, Silas had promised himself he would never again go outside the law. Never again put himself in a position where he had to choose between what was legal and what was right. But here he was, facing exactly that choice. "What would you do, Duncan?" he asked without turning around. The old rancher was quiet for a moment. "What you are doing, But I have lived a long life and made my peace with consequences. You are still young enough to have something to lose. Jonas died because he stood up for what was right. I will not dishonor that by handing an innocent woman to slavers, legal papers or not. Then you should know what you are facing. Duncan set down his coffee cup. Voss has 3 men with him right now, but he told the sheriff he has 20 more coming from Cheyenne. Could be a bluff, could be truth. Either way, you cannot hold this place alone against those odds. 20 men. Silas turned that number over in his mind. Even if it was a lie, even if Voss only had the 3 men currently camped 5 miles away, those were still odds that could get everyone in this cabin killed. I could ride to Fort Laramie, Duncan offered. Bring back cavalry. Captain Morrison is still commanding there. He knew Jonas. He might help. 6 days round trip, Silas said. We do not have 6 days. Duncan nodded slowly. Then what? Silas looked at Kaya, then back at Duncan. A plan was forming in his mind, dangerous and probably stupid, but maybe the only chance they had. We do not wait for them to come to us. We go to them first. You mean to attack? Duncan's eyebrows rose. Silas, that is crazy, I know, but they think I am alone. They think they have time to plan and organize. If we hit them now, tonight, before they are ready, we have a chance. He walked back to the table. You said you saw them in Hartville. How many for certain? 4 that I saw. Voss, the one giving orders. Big man with a scar down his left cheek. Then 3 others. Rough-looking fellas. 4 men. Still bad odds, but better than 20. And if Duncan was willing to help, that made it 3 against 4. Almost even. I cannot ask you to risk your life for this, Silas said. Duncan smiled, a hard smile that showed teeth. You are not asking. I am volunteering. Your brother Jonas helped my son 5 years ago when the boy took sick. Got a doctor all the way from Cheyenne, paid for it himself. Boy lived because of Jonas. I owe your family a debt, and I do not die with debts unpaid. Silas nodded once, the gesture carrying more weight than words. In the West, debts of honor mattered. They were currency more valuable than gold, bonds stronger than any legal contract. Then we move tonight, Silas said. Scout their camp first, figure out what we are facing, then make the call whether to hit them or pull back. Kaya stood from where she had been listening in silence. I am coming. No, Silas said immediately. Too dangerous. This is my fight before it is yours. I will not hide while men risk their lives for me. You will not help anyone if you get captured or killed. Kaya's eyes flashed. I have lived with my people my whole life. I know how to move in darkness without sound. I know how to track and hunt. What do you know of such things, cavalryman who rides a horse and makes noise wherever he goes? Duncan made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly covered by a cough. Silas stared at Kaya, and she stared back, neither willing to back down. Finally, he nodded just slightly. You stay back. You observe. You do not engage unless I give the signal. Agreed? Agreed. That night, with the moon just a sliver in the sky and clouds covering the stars, 3 figures moved through the snow toward the distant glow of a campfire. They moved slowly, carefully, placing each foot with attention to avoid snapping branches hidden under the snow. Silas led, with Duncan behind him, and Kaya bringing up the rear. All 3 wore dark clothing, faces smudged with ash to avoid reflecting moonlight. It took them 2 hours to cover the 5 miles to where the smoke had risen that morning. They smelled the camp before they saw it, wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and the particular stink of men who had been riding hard and living rough. Silas raised a hand and the 3 of them dropped to their bellies in the snow, crawling the last 100 yards to a position behind a fallen log that gave them a view of the camp. What they saw made Silas's blood turn to ice in his veins. 4 men sat around a fire, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. Silas recognized the one Duncan had described as Voss, a big man with hard eyes and a scar that twisted the left side of his face into a permanent sneer. The others were cut from the same cloth, rough men who had probably spent time in territorial prisons or should have. But it was not the men that made Silas freeze. It was the wagons. 2 covered wagons sat at the edge of the firelight, their tarps pulled tight against the cold. And from beneath those tarps came sounds. Quiet sounds, barely audible over the crackle of the fire and the murmur of conversation. The sounds of women crying. Silas felt Kaya stiffen beside him. She had heard it too. Her breathing went shallow and quick, and he reached over to put a hand on her shoulder. A silent command to stay still and stay quiet. "How much longer we gotta sit on these squaws?" one of the men asked, his words slurred by whiskey. "Getting antsy just waiting around." "Until we find the one that ran," Voss said. His voice was cold and precise, a man used to command. "She is worth $300. I do not leave that kind of money on the table." Maybe she froze. Been 4 days. Maybe, but that cabin we scouted last night, that is the only shelter for 20 miles. If she survived the storm, she went there. We check it tomorrow, soon as Pike's leg heals enough to ride to eat. Another man, presumably Pike, spat into the fire. "Leg's fine, just hurts like hell. That old man and his damn traps." So Pike had triggered one of Silas's bear traps during the scout last night. Good. That meant they were down one fighter before the battle even started. "Tomorrow we go in force," Voss continued. "4 of us armed, claiming legal authority. One homesteader is not going to argue with those odds. And if he does, then we burn his cabin and take what's ours. Simple." The men laughed, passing the bottle again. Silas felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. These men were not just after Kaya. They had other women, other victims. This was not about one rescue anymore. This was about stopping something bigger. He motioned for Duncan and Kaya to follow him back the way they had come. When they were far enough from the camp that whispers would not carry, they stopped to confer. "There are women in those wagons," Kaya whispered fiercely. "We cannot leave them." "I know," Silas said, "but 4 armed men is too many for a direct assault, especially with hostages involved." "3 armed men," Duncan corrected. "Pike's leg is bad. He will be slow." Still terrible odds. They were quiet for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. Then Kaya spoke, her voice carrying a strange calm. "I have an idea, but you will not like it." Silas looked at her. "Try me. Let me go back to them. Surrender myself. Tell them I was alone in the cabin, that the homesteader did not know who I was. Once they think they have won, once they lower their guard, you attack." "Absolutely not," Silas said immediately. "That is suicide. It is tactics. You said yourself direct assault will not work. So we use misdirection." "She's got a point," Duncan said slowly. "It's ruthless, but it might work." "No," Silas said again more firmly. "I will not use her as bait." Kaya moved closer, so close he could see her eyes even in the darkness. "Silas Hartwell, you saved my life. Let me use it how I choose. Those women in the wagons, they are my people. I will not abandon them just because I was lucky enough to escape. This is my decision." Silas wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but looking into her eyes, he saw the same determination that had kept her alive through 17 days of captivity and a blizzard that should have killed her. She had made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it smart. Plan to the minute. And at the first sign it is going wrong, you run. Promise me." "I promise." They spent the next hour working out the details. Kaya would approach the camp at dawn, when the men were groggy from drinking and cold from a night outdoors. She would tell them she had been hiding in the wilderness, trying to make it south, that she had never reached any cabin. That story would explain why the scout had not seen her at Silas's place. It would also make them feel secure, like they had won without a fight. While they focused on her, while they tied her up and congratulated themselves, Silas and Duncan would be moving into position. Duncan with his buffalo rifle at 200 yards, Silas coming in close with the Winchester. When Silas gave the signal, a meadowlark call he had learned from Apache scouts during the war, they would attack. It was a desperate plan. A dozen things could go wrong, but it was also their best chance to save not just Kaya, but the other women as well. They returned to the cabin in the dark hours before dawn, each carrying the weight of what sunrise would bring. Inside, Kaya tried to rest, but sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Voss's face, heard his voice, felt the rope cutting into her wrists during those 17 days of captivity. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. Silas worked in silence at the table, cleaning and checking every weapon twice. His hands moved through the familiar motions of cavalry training while his mind rehearsed the coming battle. Load, check, clear. Load, check, clear. The ritual calmed his breathing, but could not quiet the questions. What if Kaya froze when they grabbed her? What if Duncan missed his first shot? What if Pike was faster than they expected? A dozen variables, any one of which could turn victory into disaster. Duncan sat in the chair by the hearth, nursing cold coffee he no longer tasted. He was thinking of his son, saved by Jonas Hartwell 5 years ago, alive today because a good man had chosen to help. Now Duncan would honor that debt by risking his own life for a woman he had known less than a week. The mathematics of honor never made sense when written out, but they felt right in the chest where such things were measured. Your brother would be proud of you, Duncan said quietly, breaking the long silence. Jonas always said you were the better man, even if you did not believe it yourself. Silas looked up from the Winchester, his hands pausing mid-motion. Jonas got himself killed being the better man. He got himself killed saving someone who needed saving. That is not the same as being stupid. That is being decent in a world that does not reward decency. Duncan set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. You are doing the same thing now. The question is whether we are smart enough to survive what decency demands. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because it could not be answered until the sun rose and the shooting started. At 4 a.m, Kaya finally spoke. I am ready. Silas and Duncan stood. No more words were needed. They checked weapons one final time, pulled on extra layers against the cold, and stepped out into darkness so complete it felt like stepping into a grave. 4:30 a.m, in the frozen darkness before dawn, they moved out. Kaya walked ahead, alone, while Silas and Duncan circled wide to approach from different angles. The snow muffled sound, and the darkness provided cover, but Silas felt every nerve in his body pulled tight as wire. One mistake, one sound at the wrong moment, and this would all go to hell. He watched through the brass telescope as Kaya walked into the camp. Watched as the men around the dying fire jerked awake, reaching for weapons. Watched as Voss stood and stepped forward, his face splitting into a grin of triumph. Watched as they grabbed Kaya's arms and forced her to her knees. Every instinct Silas had screamed at him to move, to attack now, to not wait while they put their hands on her. But he forced himself to remain still, to trust the plan, to give it time to work. 200 yards away, Duncan was in position with the Sharps buffalo rifle, a weapon capable of dropping a man at half a mile. Silas was closer, 60 yards, hidden behind a snow-covered deadfall with a clear line of sight to the camp. He could hear voices now, Voss questioning Kaya, her answers calm and steady. Where have you been hiding? In the foothills. Found a cave. Thought I could make it south. Alone in this cold? I am Apache. Cold does not kill me as easily as it kills you. Voss laughed, a harsh sound. Tough squaw. That will bring a premium price. He turned to his men. Pike, get the irons. Deckard, check the wagons. Make sure the others are secure. Hoskins, you and me will... Silas never found out what Voss and Hoskins were going to do, because that was when Pike limped toward the wagons, keys in hand, and Silas saw his moment. He raised 2 fingers to his lips and gave the meadowlark call, 2 notes clear and sharp in the pre-dawn silence. Duncan fired first. The big sharps boomed like thunder, and the lantern, hanging from the wagon, suddenly exploded in a shower of glass and flame. The camp plunged into darkness except for the low glow of the dying fire. Silas charged forward, Winchester up, firing as he moved. His first shot took Hoskins in the leg, dropping the man with a scream. His second shot missed as Deckard dove behind the wagon. Chaos erupted as the men scrambled for weapons and tried to figure out where the attack was coming from. Pike, still holding the wagon keys, made the mistake of running toward the horses. Duncan's second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The keys fell into the snow. Voss was fast, faster than Silas expected. The big man grabbed Kaya by the hair, yanked her in front of him as a shield, and pulled a knife. The blade pressed against her throat, and suddenly the tide of the battle shifted. Hartwell, Voss shouted into the darkness. He had figured it out who was attacking. "Back off or I open her throat!" Silas stopped his advance, Winchester still raised. He was 20 feet away now, close enough to see Kaya's face in the firelight. She looked scared but angry, and her eyes were trying to tell him something. "Let her go, Voss," Silas called. "This is over. You have lost 2 men. The law will hear about this. Your fake papers will not hold up against 4 witnesses." "4?" Voss looked around wildly, trying to count attackers in the darkness. "There's just you and whoever has the rifle. 2 against 2. I'll take those odds." "You are forgetting someone," Kaya said quietly. Then she dropped, her legs suddenly going boneless, her full weight pulling against Voss's grip. The unexpected move made him stumble forward, the knife moving away from her throat for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Kaya twisted, pulled something from inside her dress, and drove it upward with all her strength. The broken piece of mirror glass she had been carrying since the night she escaped, the same glass she had used to cut her bonds 17 days ago, plunged into Voss's forearm. He screamed and dropped the knife. Kaya rolled away, and Silas was there, covering the last 20 feet in 3 strides, slamming the Winchester stock into Voss's face hard enough to drop him like a stone. Deckard, seeing his leader fall, tried to make a run for the horses. Duncan's 3rd shot from the sharps took him in the leg, and he went down screaming into the snow. Hoskins, already wounded, raised his hands in surrender. "I'm done," Hoskins shouted. "I'm out. Don't shoot." Pike, bleeding from the shoulder but still conscious, nodded agreement. "Me too. We're done." The fight had lasted less than 2 minutes. 4 men disabled, 2 probably dying, 2 surrendering. No one on Silas's side even scratched. It seemed impossible, but cavalry training and good tactics had made the impossible happen. Silas ran to Kaya, helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" "No, Ian." She was shaking, but from adrenaline, not fear. "The women, in the wagons." "Right." Silas ran to where Pike had dropped the keys and grabbed them. Duncan came in from his sniper position, keeping his rifle trained on the prisoners, while Silas unlocked the first wagon and pulled back the tarp. 3 pairs of eyes stared up at him, frightened and hopeful in equal measure. 3 young Apache women, all bound and gagged, all dirty and exhausted. Silas felt his rage return, hot and fierce. He cut their bonds with his knife and helped them climb down from the wagon. Kaya was there immediately, speaking to them in their own language, her words flowing fast and gentle. The women clung to her, all 4 of them embracing while tears ran down their faces. Duncan kept watch over the prisoners while Silas searched the wagons. He found supplies, food, water, extra rope, in a small wooden box. Inside the box were documents, legal-looking papers with official seals and signatures. Papers claiming Garrett Voss had legal custody of 7 Apache women to be transported to reservations under federal authority. All fake, all designed to give a slave trader legal cover to move his cargo across territory where someone might ask questions. Silas brought the box to where Voss lay groaning in the snow, blood running from his broken nose. He dropped the box in front of the big man. "These papers," Silas said. "Who made them for you?" Voss just glared up at him through swelling eyes. "Answer him," Duncan said, chambering another round in the sharps with a very loud click. "Or I shoot something that hurts worse than your shoulder." "Federal agent in Cheyenne," Voss spat blood. "Name's Hendricks. Vernon Hendricks. He makes papers for anyone with cash. Half the trafficking operations in the territory use him." A federal agent. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. This went deeper than just 4 men stealing women. This was a network with official corruption protecting it. "How many others you working with?" Duncan asked. Pike answered before Voss could stop him. 20, maybe 25 men total, all across Wyoming and Montana territories. Been running this operation for 2 years. The number staggered Silas. 25 men, 2 years. How many women had they taken? How many families destroyed? "What do we do with them?" Duncan asked, his rifle still trained on the prisoners. It was a good question. Fort Laramie was 3 days away. They could try to transport 4 prisoners, 3 rescued women, and themselves all that distance in winter. Or they could do something simpler, something rougher, something that would make this problem go away permanently. Silas looked at Duncan and saw the same calculation happening behind the old rancher's eyes. This was not the first time either of them had faced this choice. The West was full of shallow graves and questions that never got asked. But before Silas could speak, Kaya stepped forward. "No," she said. "We take them to Fort Laramie. We let the cavalry handle it." "They have connections," Silas said. "That federal agent, the corrupt officials. They might get away with it." "They might, but if we kill them here, we are no better than they are. We become the thing we are fighting against." She looked at the three women she had just freed, then back at Silas. "My people have had enough of white men who kill and claim it as justice. Let the law decide, even if the law is broken. At least then we can say we tried to do it right." Silas looked at the prisoners, then at Kaya, then at Duncan. The old rancher shrugged. "She's right. Killing them would feel good for about 5 minutes. Then we'd have to live with it forever. I'm too old to add more ghosts to the ones I already carry." "Tie them up," Silas said finally. "We leave at first light." They spent what was left of the night securing the prisoners and tending to the wounded. Hoskins and Pike would live if they got medical attention soon. Deckard was worse off, the bullet from Duncan's sharps having shattered his thigh bone. Voss had a broken nose and a concussion, but was stable. The three rescued women told their stories in broken English and Apache, with Kaya translating. Their names were Ayana, Tayen, and Shanoa. They had been taken from different places over the past month, all grabbed by Voss's men and destined for brothels and mining towns. Now they were free, but traumatized and uncertain what came next. As dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming foothills, Silas stood apart from the group, watching the sun paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. He felt Duncan come up beside him. "What now?" the old rancher asked. "Now we figure out how to get 7 people and 4 prisoners to Fort Laramie in winter. Then we figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with my life after this." Duncan chuckled. "Thought you had that all worked out. Living alone, staying out of trouble, keeping your head down." "So did I." Silas looked back at where Kaya was helping the 3 women prepare for travel. "But trouble found me anyway." "That's because you're Jonas Hartwell's brother. Trouble always finds the Hartwells. The difference is what you do about it." They began loading the wagons and preparing horses for the journey. It would take 3 days minimum to reach Fort Laramie, longer if the weather turned bad. 3 days of guarding prisoners. 3 days of hoping no more of Voss's network discovered what had happened. 3 days to figure out what came after. As they were finishing the preparations, Kaya pulled Silas aside. Her face was serious, and she held one hand pressed against her stomach in a gesture he did not yet understand. "Silas, before we leave, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" She took a breath, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "I am pregnant, maybe 2 months, maybe 3. I do not know exactly." The words landed in his chest like a physical blow. Pregnant. He had not even considered the possibility. "The father," he started to ask, "is a man from my tribe. We are not together. He does not know about the baby, and I do not want him to know." Her eyes met his. "I am telling you because if something happens to me on this journey, you need to know. The baby is innocent. The baby deserves to live even if I do not." Silas felt a dozen emotions crash through him at once. Anger at the man who had left her alone to face this. Worry about what a pregnant woman could endure on a hard winter journey. Protectiveness for both Kaya and the child she carried. And underneath all of it, something else. Something that felt almost like hope. "Nothing is going to happen to you," but he said firmly. "You are going to live. The baby is going to live. And when we get to Fort Laramie, we are going to figure out what comes next. Together." "Together," she repeated softly, and he saw tears begin to form in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care?" "Because 7 years ago, my brother died protecting people who needed protecting. I was not there to help him. I have spent every day since wondering if I could have made a difference." He reached out and gently took her hand. "Maybe I cannot change what happened to Jonas, but I can make damn sure you and that baby make it through this alive. That has to count for something." Kaya nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in her throat. She squeezed his hand once, then turned away to help with the final preparations. Duncan, who had been watching from a discreet distance, came over as Kaya walked away. She told you about the baby. You knew? I'm old, not blind. A man learns to read the signs. Duncan adjusted his gun belt. Changes things. Changes everything, Silas agreed. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I don't know what I'm thinking yet. Ask me again when we're not 3 days from civilization with 4 prisoners and 3 traumatized women to protect. Fair enough. Duncan mounted his horse. But Silas, whatever you decide, Jonas would approve. He always said the best thing a man could do was build something good where something bad had been. That's what you're doing here. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, 2 wagons and 8 horses moving slowly through the snow. 4 prisoners tied in one wagon, 3 freed women and supplies in the other. Silas and Duncan riding point, Kaya bringing up the rear with the colt at her side. It would take 3 days to reach Fort Laramie. 3 days to turn over the prisoners and bear witness to what they had found. 3 days to start figuring out what came after. But for now, in this moment, riding through the Wyoming wilderness with the sun on his face and good people around him, Silas Hartwell allowed himself something he had not felt in 7 years. He allowed himself to believe that maybe Jonas had been right. Maybe decency did matter. Maybe standing up for what was right was worth the cost. Maybe a man could build something good out of something bad if he was willing to trim. The journey to Fort Laramie was just beginning. But so was something else, something Silas could not name yet, but could feel growing in his chest with every mile they traveled. Something that felt an awful lot like hope. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks through snow that stretched unbroken to the horizon. A white expanse so vast it made the 80 people traveling across it feel like insects crawling across a blank page. 3 days out from the battle site, they crossed into Idaho territory under skies that threatened more snow but had not yet delivered. Silas rode point on his bay gelding, eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead for trouble that experience told him could appear from anywhere. Behind him came the 2 wagons, their loads redistributed now so that one carried supplies and the 3 Apache women, while the other held the 4 prisoners, bound and under guard. What Silas had not expected was the 5th man riding alongside the supply wagon. Pike, the man who had been part of Voss's gang, the man whose legs still bore the marks of Silas's bear trap, had asked to come with them rather than be tied up with the other prisoners. At first, Silas had refused flat out, but Pike had made his case with words that carried the weight of genuine remorse. I know what I am, Pike had said that first morning as they prepared to leave. I know there is no undoing what I helped do, but Voss had my brother, said he would kill him if I did not work for him. I made a choice, a coward's choice, and women suffered because of it. Let me come with you. Let me help protect these women the rest of the way. Maybe that does not balance the scales, but it is something. Duncan had been the one to convince Silas to agree. Man wants to do right after doing wrong. You let him try. That is the Christian thing, and more important, it is the practical thing. We need every gun we can trust, and I think we can trust a man trying to earn redemption. So Pike rode with them, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes watchful, speaking little but working hard. He tended the horses each night, helped the women with heavy lifting, took the worst watch shifts without complaint. Silas watched him carefully, looking for signs of deception, but saw only a man trying to carry a burden that had grown too heavy for his soul. The 3 rescued women, Ayana, Tayen, and Chinoa, rode in the supply wagon with Kaya, who had become their translator, protector, and friend. The 4 of them spoke in Apache during the long hours of travel, sharing stories Silas could not understand, but whose emotional weight he could feel. Laughter sometimes rose from that wagon, and it amazed him how quickly women who had been captive just days ago could find reasons to laugh. But he understood it too. Laughter was its own kind of defiance, its own way of saying that evil had not broken them. They reached Fort Hall, Idaho territory on a cold afternoon in early January. The fort sat on the banks of the Snake River, a trading post and military outpost that served as one of the last major stops before the hard push across the Blue Mountains into Oregon. Silas had been here before, back in his cavalry days, and the place had not changed much. Log buildings arranged in a rough square, smoke rising from chimneys, horses and mules tied to hitching posts, and the constant smell of wood smoke and cooking food. What had changed was the man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge who stepped out of the fort commander's office as their wagons rolled in. The marshal was tall and lean, maybe 50 years old, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness to be easily fooled. He wore his badge on a leather vest over a wool coat, and a Remington revolver rode his hip. He watched the wagons approach with the calm attention of a man who knew trouble when he saw it, and two wagons full of prisoners and Apache women definitely qualified as trouble. "Hold there," the marshal called, raising one hand. His other hand did not move toward his gun, but Silas noticed it was free and ready. "State your business." Silas reined in his horse and dismounted slowly, hands visible. "Silas Hartwell, these are prisoners we are transporting to Fort Laramie. 4 men involved in trafficking women across territorial lines. We have witnesses and evidence." The marshal's eyes moved over the group, counting, assessing, calculating. "Fort Laramie is 300 miles east. You are heading west. We are taking the women to Oregon first. They do not want to go back to reservations. Once they are settled, I will return the prisoners to face justice." "That is not how this works." The marshal stepped closer. "Prisoners get delivered to the nearest federal authority, which would be me, and the women get returned to their legal guardians, which would be the Indian Affairs Office." Kaya spoke up from the wagon, her voice carrying clear and strong. "We have no legal guardians. We were kidnapped. These men held us for slavery. We are free women choosing our own path." When the marshal looked at her for a long moment. "You speak English well. I speak 4 languages. That does not make me property." Something might have been a smile touched the marshal's lips, but it vanished quickly. He walked around the wagons, looking at the prisoners, examining the women, his lawman's mind putting together the story. When he reached the wagon where Voss sat with his hands bound, the marshal stopped. "I know you, ma'am," he said slowly. "Garrett Voss. There was paper on you 3 years ago out of Deadwood. Charges were dropped." "Because they were false," Voss said, his voice tight with pain and anger. "And these people attacked us without cause. I have legal documents showing—" "Save it," the marshal cut him off. "I have heard enough lies from men like you to know what they sound like." He turned back to Silas. "Problem is, even if everything you say is true, you cannot just take these women across territorial lines and set them free. There are laws. Laws that protect slavers," Kaya said. "Sometimes, but also laws that protect you if you know how to use them." The marshal pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Give me an hour. I need to check something." He walked back toward the commander's office, leaving Silas and the others waiting in the cold. Duncan dismounted and came to stand beside Silas. "This could go, Ben," the old rancher said quietly. "I know. If he decides to hold us, if he telegraphs ahead to Laramie or Cheyenne—" "I know, Duncan." They stood in silence, watching the fort's inhabitants go about their business while trying not to stare too obviously at the unusual group that had just arrived. Silas felt Kaya come up beside him. She did not touch him, but her presence was solid and warm. "If he tries to separate us," she said, "if he tries to take the women back, then we leave tonight. We do not wait for permission." Silas looked at her. "But let us see what he says first. Maybe the law can surprise us." An hour later, the marshal emerged from the office carrying a leather-bound book and several sheets of paper. He walked directly to where Silas and Kaya stood. "Silas Hartwell," he said, "born 1845, cavalry veteran, discharged honorably 1870, homesteaded in Wyoming Territory under the Act of 1878. Clean record." He looked up from the paper. "Except for one warrant issued in late February of 1879. 3 counts of murder in the death of men working for Cyrus Blackwood's cattle operation." The words hit Silas like a fist to the gut. He had known the warrant existed, had known that what he did that night after Jonas died was technically murder, even if it felt like justice. But he had also thought the warrant was old enough that no one would bother with it anymore. "That warrant is nearly 7 years old," Duncan said, stepping forward. "Statute of limitations is 7 years on manslaughter charges in federal territory," the marshal finished. "Late February 1879 to early January 1886. You are right on the line, Hartwell. The incident itself may have occurred in late 1878, but the warrant was not issued until late February 1879. Depending on which date a judge uses, that warrant either expired a few weeks ago or expires in a few weeks. Silas felt his jaw tighten. So what are you saying? The marshal looked at him for a long moment, and Silas saw something in the man's eyes he had not expected. Understanding, maybe even respect. I am saying that I have been a lawman for 23 years. I have seen a lot of men do a lot of things, and I have learned that legal and right are not always the same thing. He folded the papers and put them in his coat. As far as I am concerned, that warrant expired in December. I see no reason to pursue it. Additionally, I am ruling that these 4 prisoners should be held here at Fort Hall for transport back to Cheyenne to face federal charges. I will send telegraphs to make sure they face a judge who is not on anyone's payroll. Relief flooded through Silas so strongly his knees almost buckled. And the women? The women are free citizens who can travel where they choose, provided they are not fleeing from legitimate legal custody. Since I see no evidence of such custody, and since every document Voss has appears to be forged, they are free to go. He paused. Of course, traveling 700 miles through winter to Oregon is dangerous. They should have an experienced guide, someone who knows the Oregon Trail and can protect them. I know the Oregon Trail, Silas said. Traveled it in 1870. Then I suggest you guide these ladies to safety before the weather gets worse. And I suggest you do not come back through Fort Hall anytime soon, just in case my reading of that statute of limitations was overly generous. Silas extended his hand. I appreciate this, Marshal. Corrigan, Wade Corrigan. The Marshal shook his hand firmly. Do not make me regret it, Hartwell. Get those women somewhere safe and build yourself a life that honors whatever you did 7 years ago. That is the best justice any of us can hope for. They left Fort Hall the next morning with lighter wagons and lighter hearts. The prisoners were gone, handed over to military custody along with all the evidence they had gathered. Pike had chosen to continue with them, and after a brief conversation with Marshal Corrigan, he too was cleared of charges in exchange for his testimony against Voss in the trafficking network. A second chance, Pike had said, when Silas asked him why he wanted to keep going west. I do not deserve it, but I will not waste it. The journey to Oregon took on a different character after Fort Hall. The weight of the prisoners was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. The 4 Apache women began to relax, to laugh more freely, to make plans for what they would do when they reached their destination. Ayanna wanted to learn to read English. Tyan spoke of opening a trading post where native and settler could do business fairly. Chenoa still searched for her sister, but now she had friends to help her search. And Kaya, her pregnancy beginning to show now that she was eating regularly and recovering her strength, spent long hours talking with Silas about what came next, where they would settle, what kind of home they would build, whether the baby would be a boy or girl, and what they would name it. In my tribe, Kaya said one evening, as they sat by the fire while the others slept, children are named for qualities we hope they will have, names that speak to the world we want them to inhabit. What would you name this child? Silas asked. If it is a boy, I want to name him for your brother, for Jonas, who died protecting others, but also an Apache name. Dakota, it means friend to all, a bridge between 2 worlds. Silas felt emotion tighten his throat. Jonas Dakota Hartwell. He would have liked that. My brother would have liked knowing his name lived on. And if it is a girl, then you choose. She is yours first, mine second. Kaya looked at him in the firelight. She is ours, Silas. Not mine, not yours, ours. That is what family means. They reached the Blue Mountains in late January. The range rose up ahead of them like a wall of white, peaks disappearing into clouds, slopes covered in snow so deep it looked like the mountains were trying to reclaim the earth. The Oregon Trail wound through these mountains via a series of passes and valleys. But in winter, those passes could become death traps if a storm moved in. Silas called a halt to check their supplies and make sure everyone was prepared for the hardest part of the journey. They had food for 2 weeks, enough to get them through if they did not hit delays. They had blankets and warm clothes, though never enough for true comfort in these temperatures. They had weapons and ammunition, though they hoped to avoid needing them. What they did not have was luck. 3 days into the Blue Mountain crossing, Ayana fell ill. It started as a cough, nothing serious, just the kind of chest cold that everyone got during winter travel. But by the second day, the cough had turned wet and painful, bringing up blood. By the third day, she was burning with fever, unable to keep food down, slipping in and out of consciousness. "Pneumonia," Duncan said, his face grim as he checked the girl. "We need a doctor." "Nearest doctor is in Oregon City," Silas said. 60 miles ahead, assuming we do not hit more storms. "She will not last 60 miles at this pace. We need to move faster or get medicine back here." The group gathered to discuss options. The trail ahead was treacherous, narrow in places, with drops that could kill a wagon and everyone in it if they rushed and made mistakes. But stopping here, in the mountains with another storm threatening, was just a slower form of the same death sentence. Pike spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "I can ride ahead, get a doctor, bring him back. If I push hard, travel light, I can make it in 2 days." "That is suicide," Duncan said. 60 miles in winter alone through mountain passes? You will freeze or fall or get lost." "Maybe, but it is the only chance she has." Pike looked at Ayana, unconscious in the wagon, her breathing shallow and labored. "I helped put her in that cage. I did nothing while Voss sold women like cattle. Maybe I cannot undo that, but I can make sure she does not die because of me. That is worth the risk." Silas studied the man. Pike was not strong, his legs still healing from the trap, his body showing the wear of hard living and harder choices. But there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before. Determination. Purpose. The kind of fire that could keep a man moving even when his body wanted to quit. "Take my horse," Silas said. "She is the fastest we have. Take my rifle, my ammunition, and enough food for 3 days. If you are not back by then, we move forward and hope to meet you on the trail." Pike nodded once. Within an hour, he was mounted and ready, extra clothes layered against the cold, food packed tight, weapons secured. The group gathered to see him off, and to Silas's surprise, Pike addressed them all. "I have been a coward and a criminal for most of my life. Let me be something else for the next 2 days. Let me be the man I should have been all along." He looked at Kaya. "You showed me that people can change if they want it badly enough. Thank you for that." Then he was gone, riding hard down the trail, disappearing around a bend in less than a minute. They listened to the sound of hoofbeats fade into the wind and knew that whether he succeeded or died trying, Pike was making his choice about who he wanted to be. The waiting was agony. They moved the wagons to a more sheltered spot, built windbreaks from pine branches, kept fires burning day and night to provide warmth for Ayana. Kaya used Apache medicine, herbs and poultices passed down through generations, but she knew these were treatments to ease suffering, not cure disease. Without a doctor and real medicine, pneumonia in winter was usually a death sentence. Silas took turns with Duncan, keeping watch, though for what he was not entirely sure. Pike either would return or would not. The weather either would break or would trap them. Ayana either would live or would die. All the watching in the world could not change those outcomes, but it gave him something to do besides feel helpless. On the second night, Kaya found him standing alone by the fire, staring into the flames. She moved close, and he put his arm around her shoulders without thinking, the gesture becoming natural now. "Ayana is worse," she said quietly. "Her fever is higher. She is not waking anymore. Pike will come back." "You believe that?" "I have to, because if he does not, if she dies, then what was the point of any of this? We saved them from Voss just to watch them die in the mountains? Sometimes people die despite our best efforts. That does not make the effort worthless." Silas knew she was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the weight in his chest. He thought of Jonas, dying despite everything Silas had tried to do to save him. He thought of all the men he had watched die during the war, bleeding out in the mud, while surgeons worked frantically to keep them alive. He thought of how unfair it was that doing the right thing did not guarantee the right outcome. "If she dies," Kaya said, "she dies free. She dies among friends who fought for her. That matters, Silas. That is not nothing." The third morning broke cold and clear, and Ayana's breathing had become so shallow they could barely see her chest rise and fall. Tayan and Chenoa sat with her, holding her hands, singing quiet songs in Apache. Duncan checked her pulse and shook his head. Hours, maybe, not days. Then they heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming fast up the trail from the west. Silas grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of camp, ready for anything. But what came around the bend was not danger. It was hope. Pike riding hard, his face raw from windburn and cold. And behind him, on a second horse, an older man in a dark coat with a medical bag slung across his saddle. They barely waited for the horses to stop before the doctor was down and moving to Ayana's side. He worked quickly, professionally, checking her breathing, her pulse, her pupils. He pulled bottles and instruments from his bag, preparing injections and medications with practiced efficiency. Pneumonia, advanced stage, the doctor said. How long has she been like this? 3 days, Kaya answered. Then we are lucky. Another day and it would be too late. He prepared a syringe with clear liquid. This is morphine for the pain, and this, another bottle, is an experimental treatment. Sulfanilamide. German doctors are using it for bacterial infections. It does not always work, but when it does, it can save lives. He administered both medications, then set about making Ayana as comfortable as possible. The next 12 hours will tell us everything. Either the fever breaks and her lungs clear, or it does not and we pray for a quick end. But at least now she has a fighting chance. Pike had dismounted and stood apart from the group, swaying slightly from exhaustion. Silas walked over and caught him as his legs gave out. I made it, Pike said, his voice hoarse. 60 miles in 2 days, I made it. You did more than that. You gave her a chance. Whatever happens now, you did everything possible. Pike nodded, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and windburn on his face. Maybe that is all any of us can do. Everything possible, and hope it is enough. They carried Pike to the fire and gave him hot food and coffee. The doctor, who introduced himself as Marcus Whitman, a missionary physician working in Oregon City, stayed with Ayana, monitoring her condition, adjusting treatments as needed. The rest of the group could do nothing but wait. The fever broke on the morning of the 4th day. Ayana's eyes open, clear and focused, and her first words were, I am thirsty. The relief that flooded through camp was like a physical force. Tayan and Chenoa cried and laughed at the same time. Duncan clapped Pike on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock him over. Kaya held Silas's hand so tight he thought she might break bones, but he did not pull away. Dr. Whitman looked exhausted but satisfied. She will need another week of rest before she should travel, but she will live. The sulfanilamide worked. Modern medicine and ancient timing, that is what saved her. They spent 5 more days in the Blue Mountains, letting Ayana recover, resting the horses, preparing for the final push to Oregon. During those days, the group that had started as strangers and prisoners and captives became something else. They became a family of sorts, bound together by shared hardship and the knowledge that they had survived something that should have killed them. On the morning they prepared to leave, as they loaded the last supplies onto the wagons, a lone rider appeared on the trail behind them. Silas grabbed his Winchester and moved to the front of the caravan, Duncan flanking him with the sharps. The figure rode slowly, hands raised and visible. Hold your fire, Pike called out, squinting at the approaching rider. I know that horse. As the rider came closer, Silas recognized him with a shock of disbelief. Hoskins, the man they had shot in the leg during the dawn raid, one of Voss's men they had turned over to custody at Fort Hall. His leg was heavily bandaged, and he sat his saddle with obvious pain, but he was alive and he was here. What the hell, Duncan muttered, rifle still raised. Hoskins reined in 30 feet away, keeping his hands visible. Come to warn you, he said, his voice hoarse. Not asking for trust, just asking you to listen. Talk fast, Silas said. Winchester aimed at the man's chest. Voss escaped custody 4 days ago, killed a guard, stole horses, and rode west with 3 new men he picked up in Boise. He knows you are heading to Oregon City. He knows because I told him before I left. Kaya stepped forward, her hand on the Colt at her waist. Why would you warn us if you told him where we are going? Hoskins looked at her, then at Ayana standing beside the wagon, healthy and alive. Because Pike was right. I am done being what I was. I testified against Voss. That made me a dead man either way. But when I heard he escaped, I realized he would come after you first before he came after me. And these women do not deserve to die because of what I helped do to them. This could be a trap, Duncan said. Could be, Hoskins agreed. But Voss is 4 days behind you, maybe 5 if he does not know the mountain passes. If you push hard from here, you reach Oregon City 2 days ahead of him. Get to civilization where he cannot touch you without the law noticing. That is your only chance. Silas studied the man, looking for deception, for any sign this was misdirection. But Hoskins's face showed only exhaustion and something that looked like genuine regret. Why should we believe you? Silas asked. Because I could have ridden straight to Voss and led him right to you for a reward and a chance to get back in his good graces. Instead, I am here, unarmed, warning you to run. Hoskins slowly pulled back his coat, showing he carried no weapons. I cannot undo what I did, but I can give you a head start. What you do with it is up to you. Pike stepped forward. He is telling the truth. I can see it. You sure? Silas asked. As sure as I was when I rode 60 miles to save Ayanna. Some things you just know. Silas looked at Kaya. She studied Hoskins for a longer moment, then nodded once. We move fast. If he is lying, we will know soon enough. If he is telling truth, we cannot afford to waste time. Then we leave now, Silas said. He looked at Hoskins. You ride with us or you ride away. But if this is betrayal, you will not live long enough to regret it. Hoskins shook his head. I ride south. Put distance between me and Voss. Maybe find a place to start over if such a thing is possible. He turned his horse. Good luck, Hartwell. Tell those women I am sorry. It does not fix anything, but it is true. He rode away slowly, favoring his injured leg, and disappeared into the trees. Duncan lowered his rifle. That was unexpected. Redemption usually is, Kaya said quietly. That is why it matters. They broke camp in record time, driven by the knowledge that Voss was somewhere behind them, closing distance with every hour they delayed. The mood had changed. What had been a hopeful journey became a race. Pike, who had ridden 2 days through hell to save a woman he had helped enslave, was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. And when they finally reached the western slopes of the Blue Mountains and looked down at the green valleys of Oregon Territory stretching to the horizon, he was the one who said what they all felt. We made it. Against every odd, we actually made it. But this time they all glanced back toward the mountains, knowing that somewhere in those peaks, Garrett Voss was still hunting. Pike, who had ridden 2 days through hell to save a woman he had helped enslave, was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. And when they finally reached the western slopes of the Blue Mountains and looked down at the green valleys of Oregon Territory stretching to the horizon, he was the one who said what they all felt. We made it. Against every odd, we actually made it. Oregon City sat in the Willamette Valley like a promise of civilization after weeks of wilderness. The town had grown since Silas last saw it in 1870, now boasting nearly 3,000 residents. Lumber mills that ran day and night, shops and saloons and churches, and most important, a land claims office where men with military service could register for homestead grants. Silas walked into that office with papers from his cavalry discharge and walked out with title to 320 acres of prime farmland along the Clackamas River, 20 miles south of the city. Veterans benefits, the clerk had explained, double the normal homestead allotment as thanks for his service. It was more land than Silas had ever imagined owning, more than he knew what to do with. But looking at Kaya's face when he told her, he began to imagine possibilities. We can build a real house, she said. Not a cabin, but a house, with rooms for children, with space to grow. They found land that spoke to both of them, a piece of valley floor backed by forest, with a creek running through it and soil so rich it looked black. The location was perfect, far enough from town for privacy, but close enough for community. It was the kind of land men fought wars over, and Silas had been given it for free simply for surviving one. The 4 Apache women made their own choices. Ayanna, fully recovered from her pneumonia, asked if she could stay with Silas and Kaya, at least until she figured out what came next. You saved my life twice, she said. I want to be near people who value life like that. Tayan found work in Oregon City, helping at a trading post owned by a widow who needed someone trustworthy. Within weeks, she was managing the place, her mind for numbers and people making her invaluable. Chenoa continued her search for her sister, but now with resources and support. Silas gave her money for travel, and Duncan, who had decided to stay in Oregon for the winter before returning to Wyoming, offered to help her search. "I have nothing better to do," the old rancher said, "and a man needs a purpose. Helping find lost families seems like a good one." In Pike bought a small plot of land north of Oregon City and announced his intention to start a logging operation. "Honest work," he said. "Something to build, not destroy. That is what I need now." The spring of 1886 brought warmth and hope to the Willamette Valley. Silas and Kaya, with help from Duncan and Pike and neighbors they had not even known they had until people started showing up to help build, raised a house on their land. Not a cabin, but a proper two-story structure with 4 rooms downstairs and a loft above. They hand-hewn every log, mixed every batch of mortar, placed every stone in the foundation. It was brutal work that left them exhausted every night, but it was their work, building their home, and that made every sore muscle worth it. Kaya's pregnancy advanced, her belly growing round and obvious now. Dr. Whitman checked on her regularly, pronouncing her healthy and the baby strong. "First babies are unpredictable," he said. "Could come early, could come late. Be ready for anything." The baby came on a warm evening in late May, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Kaya's water broke while she was helping Ayana plant vegetables in the garden, and within an hour the contractions were coming hard and fast. Silas sent Pike riding hell for leather to bring Dr. Whitman, but there was no time. The baby was coming now. Ayana, who had been present at births in her tribe, took charge with a calm authority that steadied everyone. She boiled water, prepared clean cloths, talked Kaya through the contractions in a mix of Apache and English. Silas held Kaya's hand, feeling useless and terrified, watching the woman he loved struggle through pain he could not share or ease. "Talk to me," Kaya gasped between contractions. "Tell me about Jonas. Tell me what he would say." Silas thought of his brother, dead 7 years but still alive in memory. He would say, "You are the strongest person he ever met." He would say, "To any child lucky enough to be yours will be blessed beyond measure." He would say, his voice broke. He could not finish. But Kaya squeezed his hand and nodded, understanding without words what Jonas would have said. That love was worth the pain. That family was worth the risk. That bringing life into a hard world was the most hopeful thing anyone could do. The baby arrived with the sunset, sliding into Ayana's waiting hands with a cry that sounded like victory. A boy, healthy and strong, with dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like his mother's. Ayana cleaned him quickly, cut the cord, and placed him on Kaya's chest. Kaya was crying and laughing at the same time, holding the baby close, checking his fingers and toes, marveling at the tiny, perfect person they had created. Silas knelt beside the bed, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at the small miracle nestled against Kaya's skin. "Jonas Dakota Hartwell," Kaya whispered. "Welcome to the world, little one. Welcome home." Dr. Whitman arrived 2 hours later to find mother and baby both healthy, sleeping peacefully, while Silas kept watch from a chair beside the bed. The doctor checked them both, declared everything perfect, and clapped Silas on the shoulder. "You are a father now, Hartwell. That is a lifetime job. Hope you are ready." Silas looked at the baby, at Kaya, at the home they had built together. "I have been preparing my whole life, just did not know it until now." In the days following Jonas Dakota's birth, word spread through the scattered homesteads of the Clackamas Valley. Neighbor Silas had never met arrived with gifts. A quilt pieced together by 3 women from town, a rocking chair built by a carpenter who had heard about the Apache women they had rescued, smoked venison from a hunter who respected what Silas had done. Duncan arrived on the 3rd day with a hand-carved cradle made from Oregon pine, the wood sanded smooth as glass and fitted together without a single nail. Tears ran openly down the old rancher's face as he placed it beside Kaya's bed. "For the next generation," he said simply, "may he grow up in a world better than the one we fought through." Pike came bearing blankets and a promise. "When he is old enough, I will teach him to fell his first tree, And I will tell him how his father saved 5 women and gave a coward like me the chance to become something better. Ayanna prepared traditional Apache blessings, weaving protection charms from sage and sweetgrass that hung above the baby's cradle. She sang the old songs in her language, while Tayan and Chenoa, who had traveled from Oregon City to be present, added their voices. The cabin filled with words Silas did not understand, but whose meaning was clear in every note. Welcome, Poe. Protection. Hope. On a warm evening 1 week after the birth, Dr. Whitman made his final visit to check on mother and child. He found them both thriving, Kaya nursing the baby while Silas read aloud from a book Duncan had brought, teaching her new English words the way she had taught him Apache phrases during their long journey west. You have built something remarkable here, Hartwell, the doctor said as he prepared to leave. Not just a family, but a community. That is the rarest thing in this territory. Most people come west and stay isolated, suspicious of neighbors, afraid of difference. But you have woven together Apache and white, young and old, broken people and whole people, until no one can tell where one ends and another begins. That is the real legacy, not land or houses, but this. As the doctor rode away, Silas stood in the doorway of his home, watching the sun set over the Cascade Peaks. Behind him, Kaya sang softly to their son. Somewhere on the property, Duncan was checking the fence lines he had helped Silas build. In town, Ayanna and Tayan and Chenoa were building their own lives, free and safe. Pike was felling trees with honest sweat, earning redemption one day at a time. As summer turned to autumn, their first harvest came in, wheat heavy with grain, enough to sell at market and have surplus for winter. Silas stood in the middle of his field, holding stalks of golden wheat in his hands, and understood with sudden clarity what Jonas had died for. Not revenge, not land, not even justice in the legal sense. Jonas had died for this moment, for the chance that someone else might build something good where something bad had been, for the possibility that pain could be transformed into purpose, isolation into connection, fear into hope, and one man's sacrifice into another man's redemption. That night, Silas wrote a letter he would never send, addressed to a brother 7 years dead. Jonas, I am a father now. I have a son who carries your name. He will never know you except through my stories, but I will make sure he knows what you stood for. Not the death, but the life. Not the sacrifice, but the reason for it. You believed people could be better than they were. You died proving it. Now I live proving you were right. He folded the letter and placed it in the Bible Jonas had given him years ago, pressing it between pages that spoke of redemption and second chances. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The kind of good that comes from honest work and honest love, from building something real in a world that often felt temporary. Silas and Kaya expanded their house, adding rooms as their family grew. Jonas Dakota was followed by Sarah 2 years later, then Ethan, then Rebecca. 4 children, each one a miracle, each one a promise that the future could be better than the past. The farm prospered. Silas grew wheat and raised cattle, selling at prices that let them not just survive, but thrive. Kaya became known throughout the valley as a healer, her knowledge of Apache medicine combined with what she learned from Dr. Whitman, making her the first person people called when sickness came. Ayanna married a local farmer and settled 2 miles down the river. Her children grew up playing with Silas and Kaya's children. The differences between Apache and white, mattering not at all to kids who only cared about fishing and climbing trees and stealing cookies when the adults were not looking. Duncan returned to Wyoming once, settled his affairs, and came back to Oregon to stay. Nothing left for me back there, he said. All my ghosts are buried. Time to live with the living. Pike's logging operation grew into one of the largest in the region. He never married, never had children of his own, but he was Uncle Pike to every child in the valley, the man who always had candy in his pockets and time for a story. The man who had been a slaver and a coward became a pillar of the community, proof that people could change if they wanted it badly enough. And the baby who had been born in a cabin 7 years after his namesake died grew into a boy who carried the best of both worlds in his blood. Jonas Dakota Hartwell, 10 years old in the summer of 1896, tall and strong and curious, with his mother's eyes and his father's steady hands. On a warm evening in June, with the sun setting over the Cascades and painting the valley in gold, Silas sat on the porch of his house with Jonas beside him. The boy was learning to read land survey documents, preparation for the day he would inherit all of this. Sarah and Ethan played in the yard, their laughter mixing with the sound of Kaya singing to baby Rebecca in the house. It was as close to perfect as Silas had ever known. "Tell me again about Uncle Jonas," the boy said. "The one I am named for." Silas had told the story 100 times, but he told it again. How Jonas had died protecting others. How that death had nearly broken Silas. How he had spent 7 years alone, trying to outrun the guilt, until a blizzard brought Kaya into his life and gave him a reason to be better than he was. "Your Uncle Jonas believed that some things were worth dying for," Silas said. "Protecting the innocent. Standing up for what was right even when it was hard. He lived that belief, and it cost him his life." "Do you think he would be proud of us?" Jonas Dakota asked. "Of what we built here?" Silas looked at his son, at the farm stretching out around them, at the family they had created in this valley. He thought of his brother, dead in a Wyoming field 7 years before Silas had learned how to truly live. "I think he would be proud that we survived, that we chose life over revenge, family over isolation, hope over despair. That is what he died for, so people could have the chance to build good lives." He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You are named for him not because I want you to die a hero. I want you to live as a good man. That is the harder thing and the more important thing." Jonas Dakota nodded, processing this with the seriousness of a child who understands that some lessons matter more than others. "I will try, Papa. I will try to be worth the name." "You already are, son. You already are." Kaya came out onto the porch, Rebecca in her arm, and sat beside Silas. She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of comfort and partnership they had shared 10,000 times. The other children joined them, Sarah on Silas's lap, Ethan sprawled on the porch floor. A family, brought together by chance and hardship and choice, now bound by something stronger than blood, stronger than history, stronger than the pain that had preceded this moment. As darkness settled over the Willamette Valley and stars began to appear overhead, Silas Hartwell allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the blizzard that had brought Kaya to his door, for Duncan's friendship and Pike's redemption, for every hard choice that had led to this exact moment, sitting on this porch with this family. He thought of Jonas, buried on a Wyoming hillside under a marker Silas would probably never see again. But his brother was not really there, in that grave. Jonas lived here, in the name of the what beside him, in the values Silas was passing down, in the choice to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than abandon, to love rather than isolate. That was legacy, not land or money or grand monuments, just the quiet accumulation of good days, good choices, good people becoming better versions of themselves. The legacy of the honest man was not that he never failed or never doubted or never made mistakes. It was that he kept trying anyway, kept building anyway, kept choosing love and hope and decency even when the world gave him every reason to choose otherwise. Silas had learned that lesson from Jonas. Now he was teaching it to Jonas Dakota. And someday, if the chain held, his son would teach it to children not yet born, children who would carry the name Hartwell into a century Silas would never see. The wind stirred the trees at the edge of their property, carrying the scent of pine and river water and growing things. Summer in Oregon, warm and perfect, a stark contrast to the Wyoming winter that had changed everything. But both were necessary, the cold to test them, the warmth to heal them. Kaya's hand found his in the darkness, and they sat together in comfortable silence while their children drifted toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and all the complications of living. But tonight, in this moment, they had peace, and sometimes Silas thought peace was the greatest legacy of all.